There is a particular kind of silence that falls in a room full of well-dressed people when they think no one important is listening. It is not the silence of respect. It is the silence of permission. The permission to say anything. Eleanor Ashford had heard that silence more times than she could count. She had grown up inside it, had learned to read its edges the way a sailor reads weather, had developed the quiet art of becoming very still whenever it descended around her. 10 seasons in London society had sharpened that skill to something close to perfection. She was standing in the corridor outside the library of Thornfield Park when she heard it fall that evening. The house party had been in progress for 3 days. Their hostess, Lady Grantley, had gathered 30 of England's finest names under her roof for the weekend, and the men had retreated after dinner to the library with their brandy and their opinions, which, in Eleanor's experience, were both considerably stronger than the company deserved. She had been sent to deliver a letter. A small task. A servant's errand dressed in polite language, which was the kind of errand that found Eleanor Ashford in most rooms these days. She was 2 steps from the door when she heard her name. Or not her name precisely. Her category. Fairchild's voice, lazy with drink and amusement, drifted through the half-open door like smoke. Take the spinster. She is desperate. A beat of silence. Then laughter. Easy, rolling, masculine laughter, the kind that fills a room and spills under doors. Eleanor stopped walking. She told herself it was because she needed to compose herself before entering. She told herself it was because she was waiting for the laughter to die down so her entrance would not be awkward. She told herself many things in the next 4 seconds. But the truth was simpler and sharper than any of them. She stopped because she heard, beneath the laughter, another voice. Lower. Unhurried. Belonging to a man who had no particular need to make himself heard above others because rooms had a habit of going quiet when he spoke anyway. The Duke of Blackthorn. Sebastian Hawthorne. 34 years old. For years in possession of a title that had been old when the current century was young. The sort of man who made other men stand straighter and women pretend they were not looking. He laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. That was almost the worst part of it. It was a light, brief, social laugh, the kind a man produces when something mildly clever has been said in his presence and he is willing to acknowledge it. The kind that costs him nothing. The kind that told Eleanor he had heard the joke, found it acceptable, and had no intention of objecting to it. She stood in the corridor for 3 full seconds. In those 3 seconds, 10 years passed through her in a single breath. 10 seasons of careful smiles and careful dresses and careful conversation. 10 seasons of watching younger women bloom and be chosen while she stood at the edge of every ballroom and held her chin at exactly the right angle so that no one could tell, from a distance, that she was breaking. Her father's debts. Her brother Thomas's uncertain future. The house in Wiltshire that now belonged to creditors whose names she had memorized like a kind of miserable poetry. The morning she had opened the letter from the solicitor and understood, fully and finally, that there would be no one coming to save them. That if saving was to happen, she would have to do it herself. All of that passed through her in 3 seconds. And then something else happened. Something that had never happened in 10 seasons. Eleanor Ashford stopped being sorry. She was not going to walk away. She straightened her spine. She smoothed the front of her emerald gown with one gloved hand. She lifted the unsealed letter she carried and looked at it for one moment, and what she saw there made the corner of her mouth move in a way that was not quite a smile and not quite the opposite of one. Then she pushed open the library door and walked in. The room contained 7 men. Lord Oliver Fairchild, who had spoken. 2 younger gentlemen whose names Eleanor never bothered to retain because they never retained hers. Lord Pembroke, silver-haired and significant, seated nearest the fire. And 3 others arranged around the room in the casual geometry of men who believed the world had been designed for their comfort. And the Duke of Blackthorn, standing by the window with a glass of brandy held loosely at his side, who went very still the moment Eleanor entered. Not the stillness of guilt. The stillness of a man who has just recalculated the situation and found it considerably more interesting than it was 30 seconds ago. Every eye in the room turned to her. Eleanor looked at none of them in particular, which was a technique she had spent years learning and which she now deployed with the efficiency of a weapon. She crossed the room to the writing desk in the corner, set the letter down on the silver correspondence tray, and then turned to face them all with her hands folded in front of her and her expression arranged into something that was perfectly, dangerously pleasant. "Forgive the interruption, gentlemen," she said. "I could not help but overhear the discussion as I came in." The younger men looked at their shoes. Lord Fairchild's smile went sideways, the smile of a man attempting to determine whether he was about to be embarrassed or entertained. Lord Pembroke cleared his throat. Only the Duke did not look away. His grey-green eyes were on her with the steady attention of a man who had made a career of reading situations quickly and was currently reading this one very carefully. Eleanor held his gaze for exactly 1 moment. Then she looked at Lord Fairchild. "You suggested someone should take the spinster," she said pleasantly. "Since she is desperate." The room went very quiet. Fairchild opened his mouth and closed it again. Eleanor continued, in the same pleasant tone. "I wonder if you would be so kind as to clarify which debts you were referring to. My family's financial difficulties are a matter of public record, of course. But Lord Pembroke's connection to those difficulties is somewhat less publicly discussed." The silence changed quality entirely. It went from the silence of permission to something that had no comfortable name. Lord Pembroke set his glass down very carefully. And the Duke of Blackthorn, who had not moved from his position by the window, looked from Eleanor to Pembroke and back again with an expression that had shed all its earlier lightness and become something considerably more alert. "Miss Ashford," he said quietly. His voice gave nothing away, but it gave it away in a way that made you pay attention. "Are you saying what I believe you are saying?" Eleanor looked at him. In the reference image that exists in the minds of those who were in that room that evening, she is a woman in an emerald velvet gown with auburn hair dressed simply and hazel eyes that held no apology whatsoever. She looked like a woman who had decided something. "I am saying, Your Grace," she replied, "that I have a letter here that was delivered to my late father 4 years ago, signed by Lord Pembroke's solicitor, and that the contents of that letter would be of considerable interest to certain officers in Whitehall. I was bringing it to Lady Grantley for safekeeping tonight. But since the gentleman seems so interested in my affairs, perhaps we might discuss the matter all together." She said it very calmly. The way a person says something they have been holding for 4 years and have finally, irrevocably decided to put down. Lord Pembroke stood up. The Duke stepped forward. And the evening, which had begun as a cruel joke, became something else entirely. "Hey? Quick question. How are you feeling right now? Thank you so much for being here with us tonight. It truly means more than you know. If Eleanor's courage has already found a place in your chest, if you are already leaning forward wanting to know what happens next, then we want to ask something of you. Subscribe to this channel. Hit that like button. And drop a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from. Every single comment reaches us. Every subscription helps us bring more stories like this one to more people who need them. We will be right back. Now, let us return to the story. Eleanor Ashford had not always been society's cautionary tale. There had been a time, not so many years ago, when she had been simply a girl. The eldest daughter of Sir Edmund Ashford of Wiltshire, who had been a kind man with an excellent library and a ruinous habit of trusting people he should have questioned. Her mother had died when Eleanor was 14. Her brother Thomas had been 7. And from that year forward, Eleanor had been, in the quiet way that no one formally acknowledges or properly compensates, the person who held the household together. She had made her debut at 19. She had been considered handsome. She had possessed exactly enough wit to attract attention and enough dignity to keep it from becoming the wrong sort. 2 gentlemen had expressed interest in her first season. One had withdrawn when her father's name first appeared in connection with questionable investments. The other had simply chosen someone with a larger fortune and a less complicated family. Eleanor had understood. She had not stopped understanding since. By her third season, she was already beginning to be described with that particular softening of language that society used when it wished to be cruel without being accountable. Accomplished. Self-possessed. Sensible. Words that meant. We have decided she is not a romantic prospect and we are dressing that decision in compliment so it seems kind. She had continued attending every season because Thomas needed her to. Because there remained the possibility, however thin it grew each year, that the right connection, the right conversation, the right moment might change things. And because, if she was being honest in the privacy of her own thoughts, she had not yet found a way to stop hoping entirely, and she was not sure she wanted to. Her father had died 4 years ago. He had died owing money to men whose patience had been considerably less than their ledgers suggested, and the months after his death had been an education in the precise mechanics of ruin. The solicitors had arrived in well-pressed coats with their polite language and their implacable mathematics. The house in Wiltshire had been assessed. The contents of the library sold. The silver catalogued and removed. Eleanor had stood in the empty drawing-room of the house where she had grown up and looked at the rectangles of unfaded wallpaper where the paintings had hung and made herself a very quiet, very private promise. She would find out what had happened. Not what the official story said. The official story was that Sir Edmund Ashford had been a foolish man who had overextended himself and paid the natural consequence. The official story was tidy and plausible and left everyone who had benefited from his ruin entirely undisturbed. Eleanor did not believe the official story. The letter had arrived 6 weeks after her father's funeral. It had been addressed to him, delivered to their former address, and forwarded through a chain of clerical coincidences to the room in Bath where Eleanor and Thomas were then living on the last of what remained. She had read it 3 times, then folded it with great care and placed it in the inside pocket of her travelling case, where it had lived for 4 years. It was, to the eye of someone who did not know what they were reading, an unremarkable piece of correspondence. A solicitor's letter. Dry language about trusts and transfers and the disposal of assets held in trust. To the eye of someone who did know, it was a confession. It named Lord Pembroke not directly, not foolishly, but in the specific elliptical language that people used when they wanted a record to exist without making it too easy to find. A record for themselves, perhaps. A form of insurance. Or the guilt of a man who had participated in something he could not bring himself to document clearly but could not bring himself to leave entirely undocumented. Eleanor had spent 4 years learning enough about trust law, parliamentary procedures, and financial instruments to understand exactly what that letter said. She had also spent 4 years waiting for the right moment to use it. The country house party at Thornfield Park had not been on her original list of right moments. But then, Lord Oliver Fairchild had opened his mouth. And here they were. The library at Thornfield Park had not been designed for confrontations of this nature. It had been designed, like most rooms of its kind, for the comfortable storage of books that no one read and the equally comfortable display of men who felt important. The firelight was excellent. The brandy was better. The atmosphere had, until approximately 4 minutes ago, been one of genial masculine self-satisfaction. Lord Pembroke was on his feet. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, with a kind of face that had been handsome in youth and had curdled into something harder with the decades. He had served on 4 parliamentary committees and been invited to more dinners than any man in London had a right to. He was, by any common measure, untouchable. He was looking at Eleanor Ashford with an expression she recognized. She had seen it before, on men who had greatly underestimated someone and had just discovered their error. It was not quite fear. It was the precursor to fear. The moment of recalculation. "My dear Miss Ashford," he said, and his voice had the quality of a man who had spent 60 years making difficult things sound reasonable. "Whatever you believe you have found, I assure you the interpretation is not what you suppose." Eleanor looked at him pleasantly. "Of course," she said. "I would be very interested to hear the correct interpretation. Shall we discuss it with Lord Harrington's office in the morning, or would you prefer to begin here?" Lord Harrington was the current parliamentary overseer of trust instruments. He was also, as it happened, not a friend of Pembroke's. The shift in the room was almost visible. Lord Fairchild, who had begun the evening in high spirits and was finding that they had thoroughly deserted him, looked between Pembroke and Eleanor with the expression of a man who had lit a candle for entertainment and was only now noticing the curtains. The Duke had not moved from his position slightly to Eleanor's left, which was where he had ended up when he stepped forward, and where he had remained. He had set down his brandy glass at some point. His arms were at his sides. He was watching the exchange with the focused attention of a man at a very interesting chess match, and Eleanor had the distinct impression he was tracking moves she had not yet made. Pembroke, she said, was involved in a series of trust arrangements that were registered legitimately between 1807 and 1812. On paper, they were straightforward estate management agreements. Widows and families who had recently lost the managing member of their household were offered professional oversight of their assets. The fees were reasonable. The terms seemed sound. Several military families in particular found the arrangement very convenient during the war years. The room was completely silent. What the families did not know, she continued, was that a secondary set of transfer documents existed. Documents that moved the actual capital into holding arrangements that the families had not authorized and could not trace. My father discovered this in 1818. He brought his concerns privately to Lord Pembroke, believing, as he believed about most people, that it was an oversight that would be corrected. She paused. Lord Pembroke is, as we can see, still in possession of his estates, his reputation, and his seat in the Lords. My father is 4 years in the ground, and his children have been living on goodwill and ingenuity ever since. She said it without heat. That was the most devastating part. She said it the way a woman states a fact she has had years to make peace with, and the absence of drama in her voice was more damning than any accusation. Pembroke's face had gone a careful, deliberate blank. Your Grace, he said, without looking away from Eleanor, I must tell you that Miss Ashford is laboring under a significant misapprehension. Whatever documents she believes she possesses, I can assure the room that they have been taken entirely out of context. He addressed the Duke as though Eleanor were not there. It was a mistake. The Duke's grey-green eyes moved to Eleanor. Miss Ashford, he said quietly. Do you have the letter on your person? Yes, Your Grace. May I see it? Eleanor looked at him for a moment. He was not asking as a man who intended to take it from her. She understood that much. He was asking as a man who wanted to understand what he was dealing with. She reached into the inner fold of her evening glove, where she had kept it that evening as she always did when she attended events where Pembroke might be present, and produced the letter. The Duke took it. He read it without hurrying. When he finished, he read it again. Then he folded it with great care and held it out to Eleanor. Their fingers brushed when she took it. It was a very small thing. Neither of them remarked on it. The Duke straightened and looked at Lord Pembroke. I think, he said, in a tone that had shed every trace of social ease and become something considerably more direct, that this conversation is not finished. But I also think it should not continue tonight, in this company, without proper consideration of what comes next. He looked at Eleanor. Miss Ashford. I would like to speak with you privately. Tomorrow morning, if you are willing. Eleanor looked at him. She had 3 seconds to decide. In those 3 seconds she assessed everything she knew about Sebastian Hawthorne, Duke of Blackthorn. His reputation. His record. The way he had laughed 20 minutes ago. The way he had stepped forward tonight. The way he had read the letter. Very well, Your Grace, she said. But I keep the letter. He almost smiled. I would expect nothing less. The morning room at Thornfield Park received the early light well. Eleanor had been there for 20 minutes before the Duke arrived. She had arranged herself with a cup of tea and the expression of a woman who was entirely composed, which was approximately 60% accurate. The remaining 40% was occupied by the conversation she had rehearsed 3 times since 5 in the morning, the part of her that had slept very little, and the nagging awareness that she had, in the space of one evening, done something that could not be undone. She was not sorry. That surprised her somewhat. The Duke came in at precisely the time he had named. He was in riding clothes. He looked, if anything, more themselves than he had in formal dress last evening. The dark navy coat of the night before had been replaced by something plainer, and the effect was that he looked less like a title and more like a person, which Eleanor found marginally easier to deal with. He sat across from her without preamble. "Tell me everything," he said. Eleanor set down her teacup. "That is a very broad instruction, Your Grace." "Then begin wherever you consider most relevant." She had made a decision before he arrived. She was not going to perform composure for this man. She had done enough performing. If she wanted his help, genuine help, the kind that was worth having, she needed to be accurate rather than strategic. She began with the trusts. She explained the structure, the legitimate surface layer that families saw and the secondary documents beneath it. She explained what the letter contained and why it was significant, not as an emotional recounting, but as a clear explanation of legal mechanism. She had spent 4 years understanding this. She presented it the way she would have presented it to a solicitor, without decoration. The Duke listened without interrupting. This was unusual enough that Eleanor noticed it. She told him about the military families. She had spent considerable time in the past year finding them. 6 families she had identified. Mothers whose sons had died in the Peninsular Campaign and whose husbands' estates had been professionally managed into near disappearance. A widow in Sussex whose property had been legally transferred in a trust arrangement she did not remember authorizing. An orphan family in Northamptonshire who had been left with precisely enough to keep them from starving and nothing more. These were not abstractions, she said. These are specific people with specific addresses, and in most cases they do not know they have been robbed because the robbery was conducted in language they did not have the training to question. The Duke was quiet for a moment. "How long have you been collecting this?" "For years." He looked at her. She could not read the expression. It was not pity, which was the first thing she had been braced for. It was not condescension. It was something more considered than either of those. "May I ask something directly?" he said. "You may ask. Why have you not taken this to anyone already?" Eleanor had expected this question. Because a single woman of no fortune presenting financial documents that accuse a peer of the realm has approximately the same chance of being taken seriously as a fish has of being elected to Parliament. The letter alone is not enough. It is suggestive, not conclusive. And the moment I make it known that I have it, I lose whatever advantage I currently hold, and so do the families I am trying to protect. The Duke sat back slightly. "You need corroborating access to the trust records themselves," he said. "Which are held at the office of the Trust Registry in London." "Yes." "Which require either a parliamentary order or a petition from a family named in the original agreements." "Or," Eleanor said, "the private access of someone with the standing to request an administrative review without triggering a formal inquiry before the evidence is secured." She watched him understand what she was saying. He was quiet for a long moment. "You came to this party because Pembroke would be here," he said. "Lady Grantley's invitation was very timely," she said neutrally. "And you have been waiting for an occasion when you could put pressure on him in the presence of witnesses." "I have been waiting," she said carefully, "for the right circumstances. Lord Fairchild provided them somewhat earlier than I anticipated, but one works with what one has." Something crossed the Duke's face. It was quick and not quite a smile, but it was in that direction. He stood up and walked to the window for a moment. Eleanor watched him. He had broad shoulders, as the image in the library had confirmed the previous evening. He was not a decorative man. He was the kind of man who had been built for something practical and had acquired elegance as a secondary quality rather than a primary one. He turned back. "I have access," he said. "Not through standard channels. My family has a historical connection to the Trust Registry Board that predates the current administration. I can request an administrative review of trust instruments registered between 1807 and 1815 without naming names. It would look like routine oversight." Eleanor sat very still. She had not expected this. She had expected a polite offer of limited assistance. She had expected to negotiate. She had expected to give more ground than she wanted to and accept less than she needed. She had not expected him to simply offer exactly what she required. "Why would you do that?" she asked. He looked at her. "Because if what you have described is accurate, a considerable number of people have been robbed under the protection of a legal framework that exists to protect them, and the man responsible has been attending dinners in my company for 15 years. He paused. "And because what Fairchild said last night was unacceptable, and I laughed, and that does not sit well with me." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. She would think about that sentence later. She would think about it quite a lot. For now she simply nodded. "Then we have work to do, Your Grace." His expression settled into something that looked, if not quite comfortable, then at least decided. "We do, Miss Ashford." They returned to London separately, which was the only sensible arrangement, and it raised eyebrows anyway. London in November was a particular kind of grey. The streets were damp from morning until night. The drawing rooms were overheated and the conversations were conducted in an atmosphere of studied politeness that concealed, as always, the far more interesting conversations happening just beneath the surface. Society had noticed the exchange in the library. Society noticed everything that involved the Duke of Blackthorn, because he was the sort of man who generated observation simply by existing in a room, and the addition of Eleanor Ashford, the great overlooked spinster of 10 seasons, turning up in a library confrontation with Lord Pembroke, had produced a quality of gossip that London had not enjoyed in some time. The story as it circulated was imprecise and therefore considerably more entertaining than the accurate version. Eleanor was aware of the talk. She was also aware that Pembroke was aware of it, and that his response to awareness was, historically, the application of pressure in whatever direction seemed most effective. The first indication arrived on a Tuesday. Her aunt, Lady Beatrice Ashford, whose house in Marylebone Eleanor and Thomas were currently occupying in the politely unacknowledged arrangement of dependent relatives, came into the breakfast room with a letter that she set on the table beside Eleanor's plate with the expression of a woman who has read the post and found it objectionable. Lady Beatrice was 63 years old, silver-haired, with the sharp tongue of a woman who had survived 4 decades of London society entirely on her own intelligence, and the excellent judge of character that comes from having been badly wrong about people exactly twice and learning from both occasions with remarkable efficiency. "Your solicitor," she said, "has received a communication suggesting that the lease on the rooms in Bath where you and Thomas lived for 2 years may have been held under an irregular arrangement that requires review." Eleanor looked up from her tea. "That is not true." "No," said Beatrice. "It is not. But it will need to be answered, which will cost you time and the services of a solicitor, which will cost you money you do not have in abundance, which is, presumably, the point." She sat down across from Eleanor with the calm of a woman who had seen worse. "Pembroke is beginning to feel the ground shift under him," Eleanor said. "Yes. Men who feel the ground shift invariably stamp on whatever is nearest." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Beatrice poured herself tea. She had known her niece's plan for 3 months. Not the full detail, but enough. Beatrice Ashford had a gift for understanding the outline of things from partial information, which was a skill that had served her well in a life that had given her frequent reason to employ it. "You are going to tell me," Beatrice said, "that you have anticipated this and have some arrangement in place." "I am going to tell you that the review of the trust records has already been requested and will take approximately 2 weeks to complete." "And in 2 weeks?" "In 2 weeks we should have access to the secondary documents that corroborate the letter." "And until then?" "Until then," Eleanor said, "we are socially observable." Beatrice looked at her over the rim of her teacup. "You mean," she said, "that the Duke of Blackthorn is going to be seen with you in sufficient contexts that any attempt by Pembroke to damage your reputation before the review is complete will look like exactly what it is?" Eleanor said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Beatrice was quiet for a moment. "Is he aware that this is partly why you agreed to the alliance?" Eleanor considered the question honestly. "He is aware of a great many things," she said finally. "We have not discussed all of them." Beatrice set down her cup. "Eleanor, The man stepped into that library and offered you access to the trust registry records in the same conversation in which he met you. Either he is the most impulsive duke in England, or he is a man who made a very deliberate choice very quickly. And in my experience, the second type is considerably more dangerous to one's composure than the first. Eleanor looked at her aunt. She thought about grey-green eyes reading a 4-year-old letter with perfect attention. "I am aware," she said. "Good," said Beatrice. "Now finish your tea. You have a solicitor's letter to answer, and I have a morning call to return, and neither of us has time to be sentimental on a Tuesday." Eleanor finished her tea. She noted privately, smiling. That was also new. The administrative review took 16 days. 16 days during which Eleanor and the Duke moved through London in the careful choreography of people who had an agreement and were managing it in public. They were seen at a lecture on historical land instruments at the Society of Antiquaries, which had provided perfect cover for discussing the trust records and had bored everyone who was not them to a mild stupor. They attended Lady Haworth's afternoon reception, where the Duke made a point of being publicly cordial to Eleanor in front of exactly the people whose opinions would eventually matter most, and Eleanor made a point of not appearing to need his cordiality, which she had been told struck observers as remarkable. They were seen twice in Hyde Park in the early morning, which was where they actually talked. The morning light in the park had a clarity that the drawing rooms of London lacked. In the drawing rooms they were performing. In the park, before the fashionable hours brought out anyone worth performing for, they were simply two people walking alongside each other, working through a problem. The problem was considerable. The Trust Registry Review had surfaced not 6 families but 14. 14 instances of the specific secondary transfer mechanism. 14 arrangements where the documents that reached the Trust Registry matched the letter in Eleanor's possession with enough precision to indicate they were not coincidences but a pattern. The Duke had laid out the relevant papers on his study desk the morning the review was returned and had stood very still for a long time looking at them. Eleanor had stood beside him. The silence between them was different from any silence she had experienced in 10 years of London drawing rooms. It was not the silence of people deciding how to treat her. It was the silence of two people who understood, simultaneously, the weight of what they were looking at. 14 families, the Duke said finally. Yes. And Pembroke has been in the Lords for 26 years. Yes. He turned to look at her. He was close. They were standing at the same desk, both leaning slightly forward over the papers, and the distance between them was considerably less than it would have been in any formal context. Eleanor looked back at him. She had spent 2 weeks being observed with this man. Being observed by Beatrice, by society, by Lord Pembroke's circle, and by her own internal surveillance, which was the most rigorous of all. She had spent 2 weeks telling herself she was being practical. She was still being practical. But she was also, she admitted in the privacy of her own thoughts, paying a different kind of attention. There is something else, she said, and took a step back to a more sensible distance. He straightened and waited. The secondary documents. I reviewed the dates. The first arrangement was registered in 1807. My father began his own investments in 1806. He was introduced to the advisers he used by Lord Pembroke at a dinner that same year. The Duke went very still. Your father's ruin, he said slowly, was not the result of poor investment, Eleanor said. It was the result of being deliberately guided into the same trap the other families fell into. Except my father noticed. And when he raised it privately with Pembroke, the response was not correction. It was acceleration. She said it without drama. She had made her peace with this. She had made it the way you make peace with something terrible, not by forgetting it, but by carrying it so long that it became familiar, like an old scar that no longer hurt but reminded you it had been there. The Duke looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, Your father was not a foolish man. No? He was a trusting one. There is a difference. He looked at the papers. This needs to go to Lord Harrington, he said. Not an informal review. A formal inquiry. With the full evidence presented. I know. Pembroke will know within hours that the inquiry has been opened. Yes. He will attempt to discredit everything. Yes. He will begin with me. I expect that. There was a pause. The Duke turned slightly. He will not find it as straightforward as he expects, he said. I intend to be standing next to you when this becomes public. Eleanor looked at him. Your Grace. You do understand that this will be messy. It will involve your name, your family's associations, possibly your political standing. Pembroke has connections. So do I, he said. I have simply been considerably less strategic about using them. It appears I have been saving them for something. He said it matter-of-factly. Eleanor could not determine whether to be moved by that or to be practical about it. She chose practical. She was always going to choose practical. But something in the warmth behind her ribs noted the choice and filed it away anyway. The formal inquiry opened on a Thursday in the second week of December. London turned. This was the only accurate description. One day the social weather was one thing, and then the inquiry papers were filed and the name Pembroke appeared in the same sentence as the words trust fraud and parliamentary investigation, and the social weather became something else entirely. Eleanor had expected this. She had not quite expected the speed of it. The drawing room shifted in the way drawing rooms always shift, not all at once but in the particular gradual cascade that resembles nothing so much as a slow musical key change. You notice it when it is already well underway. The first indication was Lady Grantley, their hostess from Thornfield Park, who left a card at Lady Beatrice's house with a note in her own hand expressing her admiration for Miss Ashford's courage. Lady Grantley was the kind of woman whose opinions were taken very seriously by a particular stratum of society, and her card was noted. The second indication was that Lord Fairchild arrived at the Duke's house in St. James's Square one morning and sat in the front parlour for 40 minutes. Eleanor did not know what was said. What she learned afterward was that Fairchild had come to offer, in his own imperfect way, something that resembled an apology. He emerged looking considerably chastened. The third indication was the newspapers. The first piece appeared in a weekly gazette whose editor had been waiting for an opportunity to address the management of trust funds by aristocratic overseers and had now found his opening. It was careful. It named no one in its first edition. But it laid out the legal structure with sufficient clarity that anyone who knew what they were reading would understand exactly what the inquiry was investigating. Lord Pembroke moved. He moved in the way powerful men always moved when they felt threatened, which was in the direction of the weakest-looking person they could reach. He moved toward Thomas. Eleanor's brother was 23 years old, quietly employed as a junior attaché to a trade office in Bloomsbury, and was, like most younger siblings of complicated elder sisters, largely unaware of the full strategic dimensions of what Eleanor had been doing for 4 years. He knew the broad outlines. He knew their father had been wronged. He knew Eleanor had a plan. He did not know that on a Wednesday evening in December, a man would approach him outside his office and make a very specific suggestion about a debt that did not exist and a document he had never signed. Thomas told Eleanor that same night. She listened. She did not show him how frightened she was. Then she wrote 2 letters. One to the inquiry office. One to the Duke. The Duke arrived at Beatrice's house the following morning before breakfast, which was early enough to be improper and which no one mentioned. He sat in the morning room with Eleanor and Beatrice and Thomas and listened to the account of the previous evening. Then he looked at Eleanor. Pembroke is attempting to manufacture a secondary debt claim to tie up your family's legal standing before the inquiry reaches him. Yes. He needs to delay the inquiry by at least 3 weeks. If he can demonstrate that the primary witness family is legally encumbered, he can argue for postponement. Eleanor looked at her brother. Thomas was sitting very straight with the expression of a young man who has understood, perhaps for the first time fully, that the problem his sister has been managing for 4 years is considerably more serious than he had appreciated. I should have been paying more attention, he said. Eleanor looked at him. You were 23 and needed to believe the worst was past, she said. That was not wrong. The Duke looked at Thomas. The document does not exist. Any attempt to present it will be forensically demonstrated as fraudulent within a week. But the attempt itself needs to be answered, and it needs to be answered publicly. He paused. I am going to go and see Lord Harrington this morning. There is a procedure for exactly this circumstance. It is rarely used because it is rarely needed, but it allows an inquiry to be formally protected from interference by interested parties. Can it be done quickly? Eleanor asked. It can be done today. He stood up. Stay in this house today, he said to Thomas. Both of you, if possible. Eleanor looked at him. She had 10 seasons of experience in identifying which men in a room were genuinely going to do what they said they would. It was a skill born of disappointment, refined by necessity, and more reliable than she gave it credit for. Thank you, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Something passed between them that was wordless and clear and entirely outside the category of alliance or strategy. Then he left. Beatrice, who had been sitting quietly through all of this, waited until the front door had closed. Then she said, to no one in particular, "Good man." Thomas looked at his aunt. Beatrice refilled her teacup. Do not read too much into it, she told him pleasantly. I simply have excellent judgment. The inquiry lasted 11 days. 11 days of testimony and documentation and the particular kind of controlled tension that surrounds events which everyone knows are significant and no one knows exactly how they will resolve. Eleanor did not attend in person. Women did not attend parliamentary inquiries. This was one of the many structural ironies of her situation. The investigation she had spent 4 years preparing, the evidence she had collected and maintained and understood better than anyone in that room, was being presented by men in her stead. She was aware of the irony. She had made peace with it in the same category of things she had made peace with, which did not mean she liked it. She followed proceedings through the Duke, who came to Beatrice's house every evening and relayed the day's developments over tea with the thoroughness of a man who had understood, without being asked, that she needed the full account and not a curated version. She found this remarkable. She did not say so. The inquiry had a shape she had anticipated in most of its dimensions. The secondary trust documents corroborated the letter. The letter corroborated the secondary documents. The pattern across 14 families was sufficiently consistent to demonstrate that the mechanism was not accidental. On the 8th day, Pembroke's own solicitor, a meticulous man named Draper who had spent 30 years in careful service and had arrived at a point in life where the careful service was beginning to feel less comfortable than it once had, provided a testimony that the inquiry had not expected. Draper confirmed the existence of the mechanism. He did not use Pembroke's name in his first statement. By the end of his second hour of testimony, the mechanics of the situation had made the naming redundant. This is what Eleanor learned over a cup of tea on the 8th evening. The Duke sat across from her at the small table near the window where they had taken to meeting, away from Beatrice, who was in the sitting room doing needlework with the pointed neutrality of a woman who was absolutely not listening. He had come in from the cold. There was still a slight chill about him that the firelight had not entirely corrected. He said, Draper gave the secondary confirmation today. It will be in the official record before morning. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She had imagined this moment for 4 years. She had imagined it at her father's graveside and in the emptied drawing room in Wiltshire and in the small rooms in Bath and on every occasion in between when she had doubted whether any of this would ever arrive. She had imagined feeling triumphant. What she felt was something quieter. A loosening, like the final pin removed from something that has been held in place for too long. She said, "And my father?" The inquiry notes, he said carefully, formally, that Sir Edmund Ashford raised concerns internally in 1818 and that no appropriate action was taken. It stops short of a full exoneration because the inquiry is focused on the trust mechanism rather than individual victims. But it is in the record. Eleanor nodded slowly. He was not a fool, she said. He was simply too good a man to believe that someone he trusted could do something like this. The Duke looked at her. He said, "That is not a flaw." She looked back at him. No. But it is expensive. The firelight was between them. The room was warm. From the sitting room there was the faint, entirely unconvincing sound of needlework. The Duke reached across the table. He set his hand, very briefly, over hers. It was not dramatic. It was the gesture of a man who wanted to say something and had found, for once, that action was more accurate than language. Eleanor did not pull away. She looked down at his hand and then back up at him. He said, "It is almost over." She said, "I know." And then, because she had been practical for 4 years and Beatrice's needlework was providing negligible supervision, she turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that for a moment in the firelight. It was, she thought, not a bad way to be at the end of 4 years of being absolutely fine on her own. The final day of the inquiry coincided with the first proper frost of winter. London was white and sharp and still in the early hours when Eleanor rose and dressed with the particular care she gave to days that mattered. The emerald gown from Thornfield Park. The hair she had done carefully with the green pins that had belonged to her mother. The letter in her glove, as always. She did not attend the inquiry. She attended the steps outside it, which was the only thing available to her, and which she did with Beatrice on one side and Thomas on the other and her spine at exactly the angle it had been the night she walked into a library and changed the direction of her life. The inquiry lasted 4 hours. The Duke was inside. He had been the last witness called. Eleanor had not known, until the previous evening, what he intended to say. She had known, in the abstract, that he would testify about his family's connection to the trust registry and the administrative review. That was agreed. What she had not known was that he had discovered, in the course of the review, that 2 of the 14 families were connected to arrangements that had also involved members of his own extended family. Not as perpetrators. As secondary beneficiaries of diverted funds that had passed through legitimate-looking channels. He had told her this the evening before, with the directness she had come to associate with him. "I need to disclose this in testimony," he had said. "The connection to my family is minor and indirect and I do not believe my relatives were aware of the source of the funds. But if I omit it and it surfaces later, it will damage the inquiry." Eleanor had looked at him. "What does it cost you?" His expression had been level. "Some political goodwill. Possibly the friendship of 2 men I have known since school. My family's name in connection with something unpleasant for approximately 1 season before people find something else to discuss." He had paused. "I have survived more inconvenient seasons," Eleanor had said, "Sebastian." It was the first time she had used his given name. He had noticed. She had noticed him noticing. "You do not have to do this." "I know," he had said. "That is rather the point." And now she stood on the frost-white steps and waited. Thomas stood at her left. He was quiet and straight-backed and had been, these past weeks, quietly reorganizing his understanding of his sister in a way that would take him some time to fully articulate but that he had already communicated in the only language most younger brothers possessed, which was a kind of steady, wordless presence that was more comfort than he knew. Beatrice stood at her right. She had worn her best coat. This was Beatrice's form of ceremony. The doors opened at 12:30. People filed out. And then the Duke came down the steps. He came directly to Eleanor. He looked at her and said, simply, "Done." Eleanor looked at him. She would hear the full account later, the testimony, the final submission, the formal recommendation that Lord Pembroke's affairs be referred to the full parliamentary process for criminal proceedings. She would hear about the 2 men connected to his family who had listened to his testimony with the expressions of men being told something they had half suspected and had preferred not to examine, and who had been, she was told, considerably quieter leaving the building than entering it. She would hear all of that. Right now she only heard one word. "Done." She said, "Thank you." He said, "You did this. I simply had access you did not." She said, "That is not a small thing." He said, "No. But the courage was yours." They stood on the frost-white steps while Beatrice and Thomas performed an extremely convincing display of looking at nothing in particular, and the winter light came down on London at exactly the angle it does in December when the morning has been difficult and the afternoon is very clear. The Duke said, quietly, "Eleanor." She looked at him. "There is something I would like to ask you." She said, "Then ask." "But I would prefer not to ask it on the steps of a parliamentary building in front of your aunt." Eleanor looked at Beatrice. Beatrice was studying a lamppost with the focused attention of a woman who had absolutely not been listening for 6 weeks and was going to require a thorough account of this conversation later. Eleanor looked back at the Duke. She said, "Shall we walk?" He offered his arm. She took it. And they walked away from the steps and into the winter morning, which was cold and bright and considerably more like the beginning of something than the end of it. Lord Pembroke did not go quietly. This was not surprising. Men who have spent 60 years being untouchable rarely accept the withdrawal of that status with grace. He engaged 3 solicitors. He called in obligations from 2 parliamentary colleagues who found, over the following weeks, that the obligations were insufficient to shift the weight of evidence against him. He issued a public statement calling the inquiry politically motivated. The statement was not well received, primarily because the inquiry findings had been published in full and the public had had an opportunity to read them. London read. London, it turned out, had strong feelings about widows and orphaned military families being quietly deprived of their inheritances through legal instruments they had trusted. The criminal proceedings lasted 4 months. They were thorough and in several instances dramatic, in the way that proceedings become dramatic when the accused is a man who has spent decades believing himself beyond consequence. In March, Lord Pembroke was convicted on 11 of 14 counts of fraudulent trust manipulation. He was stripped of his estates and barred from public office. He was not imprisoned, which Eleanor thought was one of the remaining imperfections of the system, but he was ruined in every sense that had mattered to him, which was its own kind of justice. The 14 families received formal notification of their cases. The process of recovering the diverted assets was long and complicated, as such processes always are. But it was possible. Eleanor knew, because she had helped design the framework for the recovery claims, working with a barrister named Hale who had developed an unexpected respect for her understanding of the legal architecture involved. The widow in Sussex received confirmation of her claim in April. Eleanor received a letter about it on the same morning she received 3 other pieces of correspondence, which was the kind of morning that required a certain amount of tea and a certain amount of sitting very still and breathing carefully. The first piece of correspondence was from the solicitor handling her father's estate review, confirming that Sir Edmund Ashford's name had been formally entered into the inquiry record as an early identifier of the fraudulent mechanism, and that this would be included in the official parliamentary history. It was not an exoneration. It was better than an exoneration. It was the truth, officially recorded. The second piece was from Thomas. He had been offered a promotion at his office in Bloomsbury, which he attributed to the fact that his supervisor had read the inquiry report and had apparently come away with the impression that the Ashford name was associated with considerable tenacity. Thomas's letter was 3 pages long and contained several sentences he had clearly written and crossed out and written again, and it ended with, "I should have been standing beside you from the beginning. I will not make that mistake again. Your brother, Thomas." Eleanor read that one twice. The third piece was not correspondence in the conventional sense. It was a note. Short. In a handwriting she had been seeing on documents for 4 months and had learned to read very well. It said, "Eleanor, there is a matter I raised on the steps in December and then walked away from in a highly unsatisfactory manner. I would like to raise it again, properly, at your convenience. If you are willing. If you are not, I will understand, and I will spend the remainder of my life finding it highly inconvenient to be in drawing rooms that do not contain you. Yours, Sebastian." Eleanor read this one 3 times. Then she did something she had not done in 10 seasons of careful composure and measured responses and correct behavior. She laughed. A real one. The kind that is not performed for anyone. She wrote back. Her note was 4 words. "Come for tea, then." He came. They talked for 2 hours. At the end of the 2 hours, he asked her. It was not a performed question. It was not the speech that men in this situation were supposed to make, the one about honor and suitable arrangements and the great respect he bore her. It was the question of a man who had spent 4 months working beside someone and discovering, in the particular way you discover things when you are paying actual attention, that they were the most interesting person he had ever known and that his life was considerably better configured when they were in it. He said, "Eleanor, will you marry me?" She looked at him. She had been waiting 10 seasons for a question. This was not the question she had been waiting for, in any of the forms she had imagined it. It was better than all of them. It was specific and honest and from a person she had come to trust in the particular way that only happens when trust has been tested and held. She said, "Yes." He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. It was the expression of a man who had been prepared for negotiation and had been given something better. She said, "On one condition." He said, "Name it." She said, "You never again laugh at a joke you do not find funny simply because the room expects it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is a reasonable condition." She said, "I know." And then, because the tea had gone cold and the afternoon light was very good and Beatrice was entirely on the other side of the house, he kissed her. It was not brief. It was not particularly composed. It was the kiss of two people who had been very careful with each other for 4 months and had decided, simultaneously, that careful was no longer the priority. When it was over, Eleanor sat back and looked at him with the expression of a woman who has made a very thorough assessment and has arrived at a satisfactory conclusion. She said, "The condition still stands." He said, "I would expect nothing less." They were married in April. London came. Beatrice wore a remarkable hat and cried exactly once, very briefly, and denied it completely when Thomas pointed it out. Thomas gave Eleanor away with the expression of a young man doing his best not to show how proud he was, which meant he showed it rather completely. Lord Fairchild attended and behaved himself admirably. The widow from Sussex sent a letter of congratulation that arrived on the morning of the wedding and which Eleanor read at the dressing table before the ceremony with a kind of quiet fullness that she did not have a precise word for but that she suspected was happiness, specific and earned. Before we reach the end of Eleanor's story, we want to pause here for just a moment. If this story has moved you, if you have found yourself thinking about Eleanor's courage, or her father's faith in people, or the weight that so many carry quietly and alone, then we want to hear from you. Subscribe to this channel. Leave a like. And drop a comment below telling us where in the world you are watching from. We read every one. Every location you share reminds us how far these stories are reaching, and every message matters more than you know. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. We will love to say hello to you and know how far our story has traveled. Thank you. Truly. Now, for the last time tonight, let us return to Eleanor. Eleanor Ashford became Eleanor Hawthorne in April, and the Duchess of Blackthorn by legal designation, and herself by the only process that actually produces that result, which is the long accumulation of days lived with some honesty and a willingness to keep going. She continued the work. This surprised some people. It did not surprise the Duke, who had understood from the beginning that the woman he had proposed to was not a woman who was going to be decorative about it. She worked with Barrister Hale and an expanding circle of legal minds on a framework for the oversight of private trust instruments, particularly those held on behalf of families without a managing adult male member. The framework was not passed into law in her lifetime as she envisioned it, but it was the foundation on which later legislation was built, and her name is in the parliamentary record. Her father's name is also in the parliamentary record. She had it looked up one afternoon in the parliamentary library, and she sat with it for a long moment. Sir Edmund Ashford. Identified as an early objector to fraudulent trust practices. Cross-reference to the Pembroke Inquiry of 1820. She thought about a man with an excellent library and a ruinous habit of trusting people he should have questioned. She thought that trusting people was not, in fact, ruinous. That the ruinous thing was what some people chose to do with the trust given to them. She thought her father had understood something that it had taken her 10 seasons and one very frank library conversation to properly learn, that integrity was not a reward for living carefully. It was the practice of living with enough honesty that you could look at yourself clearly, even when what you saw was imperfect. Thomas rose through his office and eventually established his own consultancy advising families on legitimate estate management, which struck everyone who knew the family history as either very poetic or very practical, and which Thomas himself described as both. Lady Beatrice lived to 81. She retained her sharp tongue until the final week and deployed it generously until the final day. She left Eleanor her full estate, including a ring that had belonged to Eleanor's grandmother, and a note that read, "You always knew what you were worth. You simply needed someone to stop arguing the point. I have never been so pleased to be made irrelevant." Lord Fairchild became, in the years that followed, one of the more vocal advocates in his social circle for the inquiry findings, which Eleanor privately found more satisfying than she expected. Not because she trusted him entirely, but because change rarely came from the people who started perfect. It came from the people who noticed they had been wrong and decided to be useful about it. And the Duke? Sebastian. He was not a simple man and he was not an easy one, and he was exactly as direct and honest and inconvenient as he had been the morning he sat across from her in a country house morning room and said, "Tell me everything." He said it again, in various forms, for the rest of their lives. And Eleanor, who had spent 10 seasons learning to carry things alone, spent the rest of her life learning that she did not have to, which was a lesson that took considerably longer to absorb than trust law or parliamentary procedure, but which turned out to be the one she had most needed. She was not a woman who had been saved. She was a woman who had saved herself, and who had then been wise enough to choose someone worth standing beside. There is a difference. She knew it better than anyone. Thank you. Thank you for every minute you spent in this story tonight. Eleanor Ashford carried something for 4 years that most people would have set down. She carried it through drawing rooms that did not see her and social seasons that had quietly given up on her and a world that had decided, on the basis of insufficient evidence, what her value was. She did not agree with that decision. And in the end, it was her disagreement that changed everything. There is something worth holding from tonight. Not a moral wrapped in a ribbon, but something true. The world has always had a category for people it has decided to overlook. And in every era, there are people in that category who carry the evidence of something better and wait for the moment to put it down. The evidence does not expire. Courage, applied at the right moment, with the right preparation, does not go to waste. And the people who judge you by your circumstances will not be the people who are there when your circumstances change. Pay attention to who sees you clearly when there is no obvious reason to do so. If this story stayed with you tonight, if you found yourself somewhere in Eleanor, in her endurance or her precision or her refusal to stop, then please share it. Leave a comment. Tell someone. Let it reach one more person who might need it. This is what stories are for. Not just entertainment, though we hope you were entertained. But the particular recognition of seeing a life on a screen and thinking, I know that feeling. I have stood at that door. I have carried that for longer than I should have had to. You are not the category someone else decided to put you in. Until next time, take good care of yourself. Be honest when it costs something. Trust the people who earn it. And remember that the room has been wrong about quiet people before. On self-worth. Eleanor's value was never determined by whether anyone chose her. It was determined by who she chose to be, what she chose to carry, and what she refused to set down. The opinions of people who have not bothered to know you are not a reliable measure of your worth. On silence and observation. Eleanor spent 10 years being underestimated. In that time, she learned more than anyone around her suspected. The people whom powerful institutions dismiss are often the people who understand those institutions most clearly. Quiet observation is a form of preparation. On trust and its costs. Sir Edmund Ashford trusted people who did not deserve it. The lesson is not that trust is foolish. The lesson is that those who exploit trust bear the full moral weight of that exploitation. The person who is deceived is not responsible for the deception. On speaking up. Eleanor had every reason to stay behind that door. Every social convention, every financial reality, every piece of hard experience told her that stepping forward would cost her. She stepped forward anyway. The courage to speak, even when silence would have been safer, is one of the most consequential choices a person can make. On integrity under pressure. The Duke disclosed his family's connection to the inquiry when he did not have to. He did it because omitting it would have been dishonest. Integrity is not the practice of being perfect. It is the practice of telling the truth about the imperfect parts when they matter. On who you choose to stand beside. Choose people who step toward a problem rather than away from it. Choose people who read a letter with full attention. Choose people who say what they mean even when it is inconvenient. This is true of friends, of allies, and of the person you decide to build your life beside. On institutions and accountability. Lord Pembroke operated inside legitimate-looking structures for decades. The mechanism that protected him was not his cleverness but the assumption that a man of his standing would not do such a thing. Respectability and integrity are not the same. Authority should always be accompanied by accountability. On time and patience. Eleanor waited for years. She did not wait passively. She prepared. She learned. She gathered. Patience without purpose is stagnation. Patience with purpose is preparation. There is an enormous difference between the two. Good night. End of story.